Size of like the height difference about a full size adult, and if you look at the other pictures it's about half the person's height. So alright, so I'm trying to figure out the reference size to Totoro and the female in the movie based off of screenshots, movie, and references. I do want to apologize in advance because I realized most of the footage that I recorded were way too loud and not very usable. So most of the time I'm going to be overdubbing. Realistically, I wanted to do a video that was recording in real time with my voice and just kind of going through the thought process of the video, but it is what it is. Alright, so over here I'm using rivets to put everything together. Just a standard rivet gun, drill, angle grinder, a couple of aluminum 1/8 inch thick as well as 1 inch wide aluminum flat bars. If you want to go cheaper on the side, instead of going to Home Depot, I suggest looking for your local metal supplier. It's probably cheaper to order from them. Total supply for the metal materials probably took about $50, I would say. Maybe $80 if I remember. That's including the rivets and the flat bar. I think I used around about, I would say, 12 yards of flat bar. I think if I were to do this again, I'd probably make the brace a hip mount rather than a shoulder mount. It's just the brace was just way too heavy and it felt like I was rocking 40 pounds on my shoulder the entire time, especially with the weight being on top, really heavy. And then having a hip belt probably would have been a better displacement for the weight. I need the bottom part like an egg. Alright, so at this point I am drawing grids, trying to figure out a much more accurate way of formatting to a larger size. So using grid patterns is a great technique. You're just really changing the ratio from, 1 inches to 8 inches. So every 1 inch on that square on the paper transfers to 8 inches, or 8.44 inches for the Totoro that I've did. And I'm just trying to figure out how wide Totoro is going to be, how big the circumference is, and how much material I'm going to need at the end of the day. Realistically, at the end of the day, I used about 12 yards of fur of Totoro just for the bare minimum. So ideally you would want to use about 14 or 15 yards of fur. So that came up to about $300 worth of fur. That's including the white fur and the gray fur, enough just to make the arms and the feet. I had to go a little bit shorter with it near the end because I didn't have enough material and I was short on time. At this point I had about 3 weeks left to do Totoro, and I'm just starting to begin with the wireframe and the sizing and dimensions. As you can tell here, I'm just kind of looking at the circumference and the size, using the circumference equals pi times diameter, or pi times 2 times r, which is radius, and you get the circumference. And you can do this pretty much anything like a circle. With Totoro, I'm using a 2D flat plane, so that way you can see how much, size of a difference he is. And it's perfect because this frame that I used for Totoro was just a flat side. And then I just kind of guessed how tall Totoro is based off of the relative size to the child in the movie. You can buy some of these paper rolls from school supplies, and I noticed they're actually pretty inexpensive. I think I bought this whole roll for about $30 on sale, maybe $20 depending on. Right here I'm transferring the reference paper of 1 inches of Totoro that I have to 8.44 inches. So that should be in ratio of the height and the grid size that I am referencing for Totoro and the width. As you can see, this took a while, but it shouldn't take too long if you have a good system that you're referencing. And then I numbered each grid pattern just to make sure it's accurate. I did a sketch on pencil, and then I roughed it in or finalized it with a permanent marker and just kind of get a realistic size and circumference of Totoro. After this part, I pretty much calculated the width on a 2D plane, and I measured the side to side distance of Totoro on the dimensions of the larger format. So I used the diameter times pi, and I got the circumference. And so I got the circumference based off of every 4.2 inches, I think. And I decided to make 16 rings. As you can see, I'm running them down. And then as I got the diameter or the circumference along with that, I was able to calculate how big those rings are, how much the gap is on from each top to bottom. I think one of the problems I ran into is that the rings were probably not rigid enough, as well as the taping was not well done. And I think foundationally is probably much more important to get that down right. As you can see here, I'm just laying out the circumference length and testing out a piece. I kind of realized this material that's plastic, it's also covered in cloth, is perfect for dress materials. But the unfortunate part is that the material wasn't really up to my standard, and it wasn't really rigid enough to hold its shape. So I had to experiment on different ones. There was another material that's called boning for spring steel, and the one I just used was a plastic that has a cloth sheathing over it. I wasn't really too satisfied with it, so I'm going to go for the Rattan route that Adam Savage went on one of his other Totoro videos. Unfortunately, at the end of the day, I couldn't really figure out how to get it rigid enough. So I just kind of went ahead, went to the next thing, and made the brace with straps. I used nylon straps here, but I think I needed to use a thicker one. The adjustment kept slipping too much. I torched the end to reduce the fraying as well as where the rivet ends. And I was kind of worried about it falling apart while I was wearing it, but it seemed like it wasn't necessary, so I wasn't really sure. I made the buckles color coordinated so I can see which one I was putting on correctly. It was a pretty good call, I would say. So a quick tip here is that what I found out works really well is using a fine-tooth saw, and I was trying to cut it with an X-Acto blade and that wasn't working too well, but having a fine-tooth saw and just going slowly against like the flat surface of the foam cuts really well. And then after this part, I'm just testing it out. I'm gonna later on, as you can see, tape it up with gaffer's tape, or you can use duct tape too as well. What I found with duct tape is that it tends to leave sticky residues, so you definitely want to use something that's not sticky residue. I wouldn't recommend painter's tape, it's just too fragile and it'll tear. So gaffer's tape is pretty expensive, but I think it's well worth the use. I would definitely cover it in cloth next time, but I didn't have a lot of time and I wanted to make this quick. I knew I had about maybe 2.5 weeks at this point. So the material I ended up using was called Rattan. It's kind of like a bamboo material for basket weaving. It's pretty inexpensive and eco-friendly, you could say. So the rattan I used was a little bit too flimsy. I kind of regret using a 0.125 inches thick rattan. I think in the end I probably should have used a 1/4 inch thick rattan. That would have been much better. As you can see over here, I am measuring each circumference, and then if it's too short, I'll just double it together and make it a little bit longer with the tape. And I label each one using a painter's tape, marking them from corresponding order to 1 through 18. And then at the end, it worked out pretty well, but the shape of the wireframe for Totoro ended up collapsing due to the sheer weight. and the size of Totoro. So I'm not really sure how to fix that other than maybe doubling up on the. For the base of Totoro's head, where it's going to mount to the top, I ended up using a 3/4 inch thick plywood, and then made a couple of portholes, kind of like a plus sign, and just hollowed it out to make it a little bit lighter. I think it was a good call. I think you could make a little bit of a thinner piece of plywood out of the top base. Here I'm making foam bars to hold the rattan up. Hindsight, this probably wasn't the best use of the foam in time, so at the end of the day, I probably should have used maybe something that's less frustrating to use. It kept falling apart, so I just used tape, taped it up on the sides, see how that worked. I was testing my piece. As you can tell here, I made a huge mistake, and I realized that each section was way too big, and I needed to measure every 8 or 4 inches from the gap of each ring. My god, this took forever, so I think I'm never going to do this again, probably with the foam cheater bars. I know Adam Savage did it, but it was really frustrating to use and it just kept falling apart. I think in the end, having it taped or some type of form of maybe a better hook that I made for the design. Other than that, it worked pretty well looking at the progression, but man, it was really frustrating to use. So the goal for this Totoro suit was to be able to collapse it down and fit in my car. I didn't really have a big vehicle, so the only thing I could try to think of was trying to make it smaller. And I really liked the way that Adam Savage built his. Realistically, he did his in about a day, which is pretty nutty. For me, this took me about 3 weeks to do. Ideally, you probably could do it within about a week with some basic knowledge of sewing and patterning. Definitely had a lot of issues with the sewing machine. If you're going to use a sewing machine with fur, you definitely want to have a beefier needle and definitely a beefier machine, because the needle and the fibers for the fur was pretty thick, so you really had to fight pretty hard getting the needle to get threaded through. Other than that, I use muslin here, just basic templating for clothing. And then just sewed it all up, put it together, trialed and errored. I stitched up and cut part of the loose fabric that needed to be tight against the rattan. Just kind of went back and forth, trying to see how it fit. And I really liked how it went. And then after this point, I did spray foam adhesive, which is a type of adhesive from M3 that's called 77. And it's perfect for adhering cloth materials or any type of materials that you need that's not super high strength, but strong enough for it to bond against another fabric material. Definitely you want to get the foam spray ones, because the problem with the spray with the aerosol ones is that you're definitely going to have aerosolized particles breathing in, and the odor is really strong. I just kind of guesstimated and kind of fit around. There was a lot of issues that I had with the rattan at the end of the day, and I think hindsight, I probably should have figured that out before putting the fur and the rattan or the muslin and the padding. Here I'm just going back and forth, hand sewing the ends of the muslin together, and then I'm sewing the bottom part and the inside. It is definitely hot in that suit, so there's a lot of heat buildup. It was an excellent choice putting in an exhaust fan later on in the video, you'll see. And then so I'm just doing a simple stitch, just going out from the other side and in from the other side. And this took a while, maybe about 20 minutes of doing this, but it was very therapeutic.
He said, "Get your butterfly plant in here." And I was like in rapture. I was like, "Oh my God, this
Yeah, it just sticks out, and I don't like that. It just really bugs me. I mean, it's super pliable, but yeah, I'm just complaining. I can't even right now. All right, so right here, I am templating the fur for Totoro. I wasn't really sure how to tackle this problem because the fur was one shot that I had to do. And so I had to make sure I was doing it right based off a couple of calculations. And so I used the circumference rule divided by 4. And I was able to get a 4-quadrant piece of Totoro's fur. And as you can tell, I traced it, cut it around, and then I was able to successfully sew the pieces together and get a good pattern. There was a couple of lumps, but it wasn't too bad of a template. And I did a pretty good job for the first time, so I was pretty happy with the results. Templating the Totoro fur was probably the most stressful part of the process. I think for me, trying to figure out how to map a 2D plane onto a 3D object was probably the most agonizing part. I really had to figure out how to do it. I probably should have asked help of other people who knew how to sew or make 3D, props out of fur. I think another problem I also had was the sewing machine was breaking needles, and it probably contributed to a couple of factors of not, enough lubrication on the parts on the sewing machine. I used a thin needle rather than a thicker needle, and I think the thread was maybe too thin, and so it probably was catching too aggressively, or there was too much friction through the thread between the material for the fur. As you can tell, there was fur everywhere for the last 2 weeks of just doing this. Spool's not gonna fit, so I figured I'd get a coat hanger. I'll take it apart. If I can get this out. And then I'm a genius. All right, let's test it out. Yeah, it's pretty solid actually. This is hilarious. So well. Alright, as you can see over here, I'm just cutting the circle for the Totoro's belly. It's white fur. I ended up ordering about 2 yards of the white fox fur from Amazon. Just testing out how it feels, how it looks, see if it's the right dimensions. I don't know if I needed to cut more or cut less, but it worked out in the end. As you can see, I'm just marking out the outside of the template I cut out and then adding a seam allowance, which is just the fur that you want or the amount of material that you want to sew. It's kind of like when you're printing or you're doing any type of like overlays, you want to have some extra additional material that you could sew onto. Because if you cut too short and you sew too short, it's not going to really fit that well. And so you want to have a seam allowance. I used about a seam allowance of a 1/2 inch considering how thick this fur is, and so I wasn't really sure if I could get away with 1/4 inch thick. And then 1/2 inch is probably the minimum you want to use in terms of seam allowance. It's just really thick and pretty heavy, and the thread I was using was probably not the best use of making this costume, but still hold up pretty well in the end. Here I'm making the chevrons. Pretty much you can just template one chevron and works just as fine. I think what makes the costume for the Totoro and his belly pattern was just having it placed, you know, separately in enough space between each other, and just the height of it on the belly. I think one of the problems I've seen people do for the chevrons on Totoro is that they're just not spaced evenly, or they're either spaced too close, too far, or too high, or too low. So about this time, I probably had a week left doing the Totoro costume. I ended up using a adhesive contact cement glue, and it holds pretty well, but unfortunately the glue takes a while to cure. And I really wanted to sew it so that way it stayed a little bit longer, but unfortunately I didn't really have enough time. And I was like pretty tired at this point. As you can see, I kind of changed the pattern and the distancing. So it ended up being too high, so I put it a little bit lower. Actually made it look better and close to the accuracy of Totoro. So dumb. I didn't realize I didn't review any of my footage of everything so far. So all I've been doing is just recording and then offloading to a drive. And then here is I just go for a rant for about 2 minutes long because I was faulty equipment, yada yada yada, first world problems. Okay. Making the ears for Totoro, pretty much I'm using just padded foam. You can buy this at like any sewing store or some hobby store. Just padding, about 1 inch thick. And then I put some aluminum wire in between. I put a curve in it so that way it doesn't spin when you're holding it at it, like, you know, whatever centerpiece, because if you put a metal pole, it's going to turn on the axis. So I just made a S shape in it that kind of holds it in place, and I'm going to wrap it in fur. Well, all right, it is finished. I made the ears. All I did was just did 2 pieces, sewed right in the middle between the two, get the shape of the outline. And the bottom part, I'm just gonna hand sew it, and then I'm just gonna stick it in, and then put like a pendulum or like a little weight on top, so it just kind of stays up. It is go time. So I have about 4 more days left in terms of putting everything together to be complete. I do want to get it out on Friday or Saturday. If not, Sunday would be the latest. And if I don't, I'll just wait till next year and just refine a little bit more. But ideally, having pressure is probably better to get finished than rather than not having pressure. So perfectionism is out the window and just going for good enough. And that's where I'm going for right now. Hi, I just want to interrupt myself from this monologue. I'm going to be making a couple of demos or smaller models of Totoro's arms. I'm just testing out how it feels with the bigger sheets. I wasted way too much paper doing this, and I should have made a smaller form. And then I got a little tiny Totoro model that I had that was pretty much replicated with the arms, and I really liked the way it looks, and so that's the way I copied it. And it's just a little blob, circular thumb shaped Totoro. Alright, so here I am mounted the camera on top of the Totoro and seeing how it works from the internal view. And it seems like it works pretty well. It's a very top to down view. Everything else is kind of just testing at the moment. And I think I realized here that the biggest problem would be the battery. But fortunately, I've had a friend that helped me out and gave me an extra external battery for the top of the exhaust fan and for the GoPro camera as well as the monitor. Alright, so you may see me sewing a lot of the fur together, and what ended up happening here is that I ended up not having enough material, and so I had to stitch a couple of pieces that was about a quarter of the size of the paw, so I did 4 sections of the arms, and so it was big enough. Unfortunately, I didn't really account for the weight and size for Totoro to hold up with the rattan inside. And so as you can see, I hand stitched the Totoro's arm to it using a hidden stitch, and you can pretty much Google it. It's on Google, it's just, or YouTube, it just shows up like a stitch where you're pretty much folding each side and you're kind of going through each one back and forth. And it gives like a standard like perpendicular stitch, and you can hide it when you pull the thread tight. And I added some muslin and poly cotton to the inside to make it poofier, but I think that ended up becoming a mistake because it ended up also being a little too heavy on the side. And you can tell from when I started attaching the arms, it started to buckle and it caused the Totoro to look like a pancake from the front, and the side looks wider, so it didn't look at too bad, but I really had to figure out a problem to compensate for it, and I still haven't figured out how to fix it. So I think I just need to double up the rattan and counterbalance the front and back for the Totoro. As you can see here, I'm just kind of measuring, checking out everything else in terms of like the fitting and the height. And it's a little bit lopsided from what I noticed. And and I cut a hole in the side of the Totoro so I can fit my arm, just in case if I need to show my pass to conventions or anything like that, because I wasn't really sure if I had anybody to help me on convention day, since everybody and most of my friends partied pretty hard last night. So I used a leather stitch type of needle, and I ended up having to wear gloves because the fur was so difficult to push in and it was really hurting my fingers. So one of the tips I would recommend is just having some gardening gloves, leather gloves that you're able to push the needle through the fur. Just make sure you don't catch your fingers too. And then here are the eyeballs. I ended up making a huge mistake and ran out of primer, so I tried to use the leftover primer that I had, and apparently I didn't let enough primer on top of the spheres. They were made of foam, and so what ended up happening is that the paint ended up eating through the foam, and I was freaking out. This was like the last day of Friday, and the eyeballs ended up being kind of okay. I'm not too happy about it, and then it just kind of worked out in the end anyways. Oh, I'm an idiot. Forgot to record myself cutting EVA foam, just slits, for the whiskers for Totoro. And then I wanted to spray paint the eyes to make it shiny, but I think that backfired, so I need to buy new ones. So for this point, I just cut out little tiny holes for the whiskers and then mounted the EVA through the holes. Didn't do anything special. They just kind of stayed by friction. And then I'm making the leaf for the top part of the Totoro. It's called a fuki leaf from Japanese native plants that's around with Totoro's movie. I looked it up. I used some aluminum bendable wires and then glued it together with adhesive glue. Pretty simple. It was just a round shape, kind of like an elephant leaf ear leaf. And then for the eyeballs, I used aluminum wire, hot glued the back with the wire, and then just looped it through a hole or slit that I made for the eyes for Totoro. I also wanted to apologize because I totally forgot how I didn't even take any pictures for the Totoro of the final product. So here's some pictures.